Oh, that's now. I didn't go.
Come on, have a seat. Will you join us?
He's just looking what's up.
Just looking, okay, testing the water.
I saw Lois. Did you hear?
I guess I'd say no, but
Yeah. No, I've picked up and I asked you to
that's best.
Here's the handout. There's a couple of handouts. Alright, hello. Whether you're in place or not. Okay, what this is a read. And I can't claim that it's necessarily a Christian read. I don't know what that means. But I am in need of a conversation about environmental conditions and situations and whatever. And so I've been wanting to talk about it for a long time with a number of people. And so when the idea of a read came along, okay, here we go. And I picked a book called The End of Nature by William McKibben. It's not a new book. He wrote it, I think, in 1978. But this is why I picked it, is because I wanted something about the environment, but I wanted somebody who had some connection to a faith. Now, most writers on the environment are just going to talk about what's going on, what the facts are, what the statistics are, what the projections are, where the carbon is going, and what's going to happen to it, etc., and to us. And I wanted somebody who could at least connect to a faith, and most don't, as I said. But Bill McKibben, who's been in Ann Arbor many times, is not afraid to say he's a member of the Methodist Church, little Methodist church in the Adirondacks, where he was living when he wrote this. And then he teaches Sunday school. And he doesn't know much about theology, but he likes the hymns, and he likes the people. So he goes. And he has a sense of the stewardship of the earth that's needed to keep the earth going. So, and I know him to be a good writer. That was the other. I needed somebody who wrote. Now, there are books on science, which some of you would read, maybe, and I might not. And I gave you, or I have available, a list of the books I own that have something to do with nature. She has them. Nature, or spirituality of nature, or poetry of nature, or even the science. And some of those are here. I couldn't bring them all. It was too heavy. So if you want to look at them, the science ones are like A World Without Ice by Henry Pollack, who lives in Ann Arbor. He was a member of the geology faculty. Or Rachel Carson, and everybody should do that. Or E.O. Wilson, former biology professor at Harvard. Very, very, very well known, highly respected. But then I also have Wendell Berry, who's an essayist, a farmer in Kentucky, and a poet, and an environmentalist. So you can look at those afterward. You can ask me about them if you want. So looking through Bill's book, I picked out some sections we could read, just to give you an idea of what he's talking about and how he talks, how he writes. And I want to read them myself, because it's hard for me. So I have a section, I've made up sections, and they're numbered, and I've given them to people, so we'll just listen to people read. Okay, and then we can talk afterward if you want.
I'm on.
You're on.
17 years ago, those of us who were convinced that the climate was warming fast were out on a limb. A sturdy limb, the fact that carbon dioxide trapped heat near the planet seemed irrefutable, but a limb nonetheless. All the studies and reports that catalog the greenhouse effect fit neatly on my desk when I was writing this book. The science was still in many ways rudimentary, and so it was no surprise when that science and the conclusions drawn from it came under attack. That's how science works. Each hypothesis is tortured to find its weakness. By now, the studies on global warming would fill an airplane hangar. Postdocs have tapped into tundra, overflown rainforests, launched satellites, collected ancient pollen, counted tree rings, cored ice sheets, floated weather balloons, sent sound waves across entire oceans. Unlike the politicians, they really have worked overtime. And what have they learned? That the predictions of a decade ago were remarkably close to correct. We know a lot more about cloud formation and sulfur particles and sunspots than we did in 1989, but the expectation about how it will all sum out is essentially the same. Human beings, with their cars and factories and burning rainforests, will increase the planet's temperature 3 or 4 degrees in the century to come.
The science, however, was only one part of the original book, and not its most important. What mattered most to me was the inference I drew from that science, that for the first time human beings had become so large that they altered everything around us, that we had ended nature as an independent force, that our appetites and habits and desires could now be read in every cubic meter of air, in every increment on the thermometer. This doesn't make the consequences of global warming any worse in a practical sense, of course. We'd be as tough a spot if the temperature was going up for entirely natural reasons. But to me, it made this historical moment entirely different from any other, filled with implications for our philosophy, our theology, our sense of self. We are no longer able to think of ourselves as a species tossed about by larger forces. Now we are those larger forces. Hurricanes and thunderstorms and tornadoes become not acts of God, but acts of man. That was what I meant by the end of nature.
Beginning with the invisible releases of radiation, and then the toxic pollutants like DDT, and then the byproducts of large-scale industrialization like acid rain, though we began to alter even those places where we were not. Short of wide-scale nuclear war, global warming presents the largest imaginable such alteration. By changing the very temperature of the planet, we inexorably affect its flora, its fauna, its rainfall and evaporation, the decomposition of its soils. Every inch of the planet is different. Indeed, the physics of climate means the most extreme changes are going on at the North and South Poles, farthest from human beings. The byproducts, the pollutants of one species has become the most powerful force for change on the planet. This change in quantity is so large that it becomes a change in quality. The story of our moment, of these few short decades when we happen to be alive, is the story of crossing that threshold. The scariest part of the chemistry of global warming involves feedback loops. The idea that as you raise the temperature, you cause changes that will raise the temperature even more. If you warm the Arctic, for instance, thawing tundra may release huge amounts of carbon that will in turn accelerate the warming. But in ending nature, in finishing off that separate realm that has always served to make us feel smaller, we've completed a feedback loop of our own. It's harder to go to the forest now, or to the mountains, or to the oceans, or even to a patch of wildflowers and feel the same kind of wonderful smallness. Those Coke cans are everywhere. We're everywhere.
So people sometimes ask, how should I cope with the sadness of watching nature end in our lifetimes? And with the guilt of knowing that each of us is in some measure responsible? The answer to the second part is easier at the very least. We have to put up a good fight. I've worked on and written about materialism, population, and planning in the last decade, knowing that how well we control our numbers, our appetites, and the efficiency with which we satisfy those appetites will ordain just how desperate the situation becomes. They are the battles for our time, as morally compulsory as the battles for civil rights or against totalitarianism. Consider our one set of statistics. The average Western European uses about half as much energy as the average American. This is not because they're living austere lives or dwelling in caves, as travelers know. Life in Paris or Amsterdam or Oslo is as elegant and dignified as anything America has to offer. Nor is it because they possess some miracle technology.
What was the last number there?
6.
Who's got 7?
Oh, that's me. I was just supervised.
What?
Nature, we believe, takes forever.
No, that's right. That's right.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Nature, we believe, takes forever. It moves with infinite slowness through the many periods of its history, whose names we dimly recall from high school biology. The Devonian, the Jurassic, Cretaceous, the Pleistocene. Ever since Darwin, nature writers have taken pains to stress the incomprehensible length of this path. So slowly, oh so slowly have the great changes been brought about, wrote John Burroughs at the turn of the century. Our comforting sense of the permanence of our natural world, our confidence that it will change gradually and imperceptibly, if at all, is then the result of a subtly warped perspective. Changes that can affect us can happen in our lifetime in our world, not just changes like wars, but bigger and more sweeping events. I believe that without recognizing it, we have already stepped over the threshold of such a change, that we are at the end of nature. By the end of nature, I do not mean the end of the world. The rain will still fall and the sun shine, though differently than before. When I say nature, I mean a certain set of human ideas about the world and our place in it. But the death of those ideas begins with the concrete changes in the reality around us, changes that scientists can measure and enumerate. More and more frequently, these changes will clash with our perceptions until finally our sense of nature as eternal and separate is washed away, and we will see all too clearly what we have done.
Number 9. 8.
I read 7 and 8, so.
I think you skipped 5.
I think so too, that's why I was stunned.
I got 5.
You have 5?
I have 5 and 6.
Oh, okay.
Then you skipped 4.
No, I did 3 and 4.
7 and 8, so we're at 9 now.
You're at
Number
9.
Number 9, Ron?
Who's 6?
No,
No,
we're at
no,
9.
nine.
We're at number 9 now. 9.
9?
Yeah.
Well, there are 5 of them.
But- but several of us had 2 sections.
I've got 9 here.
Yeah, that would be you.
9 is, how will we feel the end of nature? In many ways, I suspect, if nature means Bertram's great joy at fresh and untrammeled beauty, its loss means sadness at man's footprints everywhere. But, as with the death of a person, there is more than simple loss, a whole opening up. There are also new relationships that develop, and strains and twists in old relationships. And since this loss is peculiar and not having been inevitable, it provokes profound questions that don't arise when a person dies. The first of these questions, I think, has to do with God. It may seem odd to take a physical event and go straight to the metaphysical for its meaning. But, as we have seen, nature is as much an idea as a fact. And in some ways, that idea is connected with God. I hesitate to go further than that, for I am no theologian. I am not even certain that what I mean by God. Perhaps some theologians join me in this difficulty. It is not a novel observation that religion has been in decline in the modern era. Despite the recent rise of fundamentalism, that's the end of it. So number 10 is next.
And though, as time went on, we began to give our God's human features, much feeling still adheres to the forests and fields and birds and lions. Else why should we moan about the desecration of our environment? I am a reasonably orthodox Methodist, and I go to church on Sunday because fellowship matters, because I find meaning in the history of the Israelites and in the Gospels, and because I love to sing hymns. But it is not in God's house that I feel his presence most. It is in his outdoors, on some sun-warmed slope of pine needles, or by the surf. It is there that the numbing categories men have devised to contain this mystery, sin and redemption and incarnation and so on, fall away, leaving the overwhelming sense of the goodness and the sweetness at work in the world. Perhaps this emotion has dimmed in an urban age, and most people now perceive God through the Christian Broadcasting Network. There is no question, though, that this is one thing nature has meant, and meant not just to the ancients, but to the great American naturalists who first helped us see the outdoor world as more than a source of raw materials or the home of dangerous animals. We now use the word nature very much as our fathers used the word God. John Burroughs wrote at the turn of the century. And I suppose, back of it all, we mean the power that is everywhere present and active, and in whose lap the visible universe is held and nourished.
Simply saying that we apprehend God in nature, however, is just a beginning. It may be true, as a mystic once contended, that most people, sometime in their lives, are moved by natural beauty to a mood of heightened consciousness, in which each blade of grass seems fierce with meaning. But the question is, what meaning? All nature, contended another mystic a century ago, is a language in which God expresses his thought. Very well. Well, what thought is that? That's number 11.
Wild nature, then, has been a way to recognize God and to talk about who He is, even as in Job, a way for God to talk about who He is. How could it be otherwise? What else or is or was beyond human reach? In what other sphere could a deity operate freely? It is not chance that every second hymn in the hymn book rings with the imagery of the untouched outdoors. All thy works with joy surround thee, earth and heaven reflect thy rays, we sing to Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Sheep and harvests are the other common motifs of the Bible, are not just metaphors, they are also the old reality of the earth, a place where people depended for both life and meaning on the nature they found around them. We plow the fields and scatter the good seed on the land, but it is fed and watered by God's almighty hand. He sends the snow in winter, the warmth to swell the grain, the breezes and the sunshine and soft, refreshing rain. All good gifts around us are sent from heaven above. So what will the end of nature as we have known it mean to our understanding of God and of man? The important thing to remember is that the end of nature is not an impersonal event like an earthquake. It is something we humans have brought about through a series of conscious and unconscious choices. We ended the natural atmosphere, and hence the natural climate, and hence the natural boundaries of the forests, and so on. In so doing, we exhibit a kind of power thought in the past to be divine, much as we do by genetically altering life. We as a race turn out to be stronger than we suspected, much stronger. In a sense, we turn out to be God's equal, or at least His rival, able to destroy creation. This idea, of course, has been building for a while. We became less and less capable of seeing ourselves as small within creation, partly because we thought we could comprehend it statistically, but also because we were becoming creators ourselves of a mechanical creation by which we felt ourselves greatly magnified, writes the essayist Wendell Berry. Why, after all, should one get excited about a mountain when one can see almost as far from the top of a building, much farther from an airplane, farther still from a space capsule? And our atomic weapons obviously created the possibility that we could exercise godlike powers.
And that's all I chose. I didn't know how much time it would take just to read, and I wanted you to read.
No, it was good.
So, do you have thoughts? What would you take away from this?
I have a map at home, made in 1770. And Lake Superior in that map is about 20 or 30 feet lower than it is now. I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not.
You're talking the depth of water?
Depth
Of water.
and that map, they show 5 or 6 islands in Lake Superior that you don't see now.
Yes. Yeah. That's because that was at the end of an ice age. And the glaciers were holding a lot more water than they are now. And at the end of that ice age, then water level rose in all the Great Lakes.
So this is 1770 map,
Yeah.
way to the glaciers.
No. There is what's called the Little Ice Age. That occurs from around 1300 down to about 1850, something like that. Yeah. It actually coincides with, and then this is why there's so much argument about, has man really caused all of this change in nature? Because the warming of temperatures coincided with the rising of the Industrial Revolution back in the 1750s, 1800s, at the same time that those glaciers started to melt. And is that a natural phenomenon or is that a man-made phenomenon? Part of the problem is that we've had these many ice ages and melts over the eons. This is not the first time this has happened. And the question is, and I believe that I'm not arguing that it's not happening, but the problem is that if this has been repeated prior, how can we be sure that this is man-made at this point? That's the argument against all the scientific data. But this has happened before, this is not the first time. But that's why you see those islands in the middle of Lake Superior, because there were glaciers, much more extensive glaciers back then in 1700 than there are now, right? And they were holding all that water and they started to melt, so. And there were even Indian villages way out there in Lake Superior that you could you don't see anymore.
Yeah, it's confusing it's hard to know whether it's a natural progression or change of temperature and climate. I just read the other day that one of the glacial ice spaces in the Arctic is increasing now. It hasn't been reported that much, but again, it's that natural progression. But what bothers me, and I fully agree that we've got a lot of work to do to preserve nature and to help, but the thing that really concerns me is the pollution that's coming into our waters. And a lot of it out of our control, that we're getting so much pollution from the west side of our country that's floating into the west coast, and it's getting to be a real problem. Now that's not our fault as Americans, although we do plenty of polluting ourselves. But this has got to be on a worldwide scale for solving some of the problems. We've got to do everything we can, but it's got to be more than that.
And the plastics in the ocean too. The
Yes.
plastics that's
Yes.
just filling up the ocean.
That's what I mean.
Don't ask for plastic straws.
I don't want to take anything away from average temperatures rising, but I'm also extremely concerned about plastics
Yes.
and other
Yes.
forms of pollution.
Yeah.
I don't think that we should focus on one and ignore the other. I think that they both need to be resolved. And I guess I didn't know, even a year ago, I didn't know that 99.9% of the pollution in the ocean is plastic, because everything else, even metal and glass, which we perceive as permanent things, they biodegrade on a much shorter scale than plastic.
I wish we could take that plastic and find some kind of aggregate to use to pave the roads.
There you go.
Don't you think that, it seems like it should.
You have to figure out how to collect it first.
I know, it seems like, wow, couldn't we, is there some way we?
Actually, I think in many respects that probably is possible. Typically the challenge with a lot of those things is really, it's not so much do we have the technology to do that, but are we willing to pay the financial burden to actually make it happen?
Right.
And so, and it can be as simple as, why do so many people drink bottled water?
I know.
I stopped. Bottled water.
But again, and some of it has to do with, our tendencies, associated with either believing that in fact our own water supplies are tainted, and that somehow bottled water is better. And I think there's really good research out there to suggest that that's certainly not always true. But at the same point in time, it is a convenience that I think we probably all fall into, on occasion. I was at the Synod Assembly, for the last 2 days, and they had bottled water there, and you find yourself, walking by the table and picking it up, and you're halfway through, you're going, what am I doing?
I was on Macklin Island just a couple of days ago, and I forgot all my water bottles. So I went into a store and bought a bottle of water because I wanted a bottle of water while I was riding that bike there. But I did use that one bottle of water, and I kept refilling it, so it wasn't all bad. And there was an interview with somebody on CNN, I think, not long ago, talking about the downside of recycling. And he was saying the downside of recycling is it gives us this mindset that it's okay to use these one-use things because we can just recycle them. And what we really need to be doing is reducing our use of single-use products in the first, and then of course recycling the ones we do use.
I mean, just this past week, there was a science geeky article that talked about new polymers and that are being created that would have the potential of being plastic substitutes. And the advantage of these new polymers is that in fact they are biodegradable. And so again, the big problem associated with this is more expensive to make the polymers. And so adoption and integration into our commercial stream, if you will, is going to be a big challenge. And do we see the problem as large enough to actually change our consumer habits?
I always think about, I understand the expense involved, but I think of after the Second World War when so many cities were devastated, flattened, and all the damage to London, to Tokyo, to cities in Germany, expense to rebuild. I mean, they did. They did it. How did they do it? How did they find money for that? The legislature.
I'm going to tell you folks, it's all about attitude. And because when we were in Alaska, in the hotel rooms, they have recycle bins. And no matter where you are, there are recycle bins. You're on a bus tour, and the driver collects. He has two bags. He has trash. He has the recycles, and he makes a big point of saying you can eat on my bus, but you cannot throw anything out. So it's attitude, because they know that their nature is what keeps the people coming. So for them, now on the opposite side of that, when we were in Mexico, the attitude is totally different. We would walk along the beach and, stumble over flip-flops and beer cans and whatever. And so it's all about the attitude. And that's where, as people, I know people who even today say, oh, I already took the recycle out, just throw it in the trash. It's attitude.
I've been thinking about this cost, the cost break even, ROI, whatever. I've been thinking about this lately because I had an interview recently where the guy was saying, this product is so much better, it lasts longer, and in the long run, it's going to save people money, but it costs, XYZ costs more. And I was thinking, TV used to be free. Think about that. TV was free.
So was the internet.
And we now pay a lot for TV. So how does that change? And nobody thinks, really, people don't think,
everybody has cell phones, whether they have a 4 or not.
So
you have the three comments there. By the way, I still have free TV.
I do too. I still have some free TV, but I'm saying.
As you know, I've spent a lot of time up in that north region, and some of those villages up along the Beaufort Sea there are taking a vote, probably as we speak, as to whether to pack up and move the villages who have been there for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. The second thing is that in the middle of the Pacific and in the middle of the Atlantic, there are huge accumulations of plastics. I mean, tons and millions of tons.
You remember when the
one can get that if they're willing to spend the money on it to get it out of there.
Right.
Now the third thing is, there's a book, having spent a lot of time in worrying about where the ice is with various sensors. There's a book entitled The Future History of the Arctic. And this is a combination of environmental thoughts and a political thoughts, because you've got what is it? Norway, Russia, Finland, United States, Canada,
Mongolia.
and that's it, I think, that have contiguous surface areas in the Arctic. And as mentioning to Ron, years ago, we'd go up there to look and map it, and there's no way you can get a boat through there. As recent as last year, ships have gone through the Northwest Passage, and they've gone through the Northeast Passage. And this book talks about they're assuming that that's going to happen, and they're talking about some of the upcoming political harangues that are going to be happening.
No, I was just going to say the luxury liners, they were caught throwing trash overboard and taking big bags.
That makes me sick in my stomach.
Yeah, I know.
Have you heard of the little girl from Sweden who's 16 years old, and she is, for the climate change, they skip school on Friday to protest climate change.
Right.
And it's listen to her.
There's somebody on the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah,
is that her?
With
I don't know.
grades.
There's a girl on the
I
cover.
think that's her. That's her.
It is.
And you should hear her. You should listen to her. It's just amazing what she's trying to do. And
One other quick thing. Part of the reason that over the last 40, 50 years, we've been concerned about where the ice is and isn't, is because of the input to a meteorological model that helps predict what the weather and stuff is going on. Now, as that open water becomes more a higher percentage, we don't have to go out there and look anymore. It's all water, and the model will change drastically, and our weather will change drastically.
And the way we get gas, you could all see or read and stuff like that too.
We spend millions and millions just trying to map that.
There's, for anyone who's, there's an old map on the table over there, National Geographic. It's about what's the title of it?
Endangered.
Endangered, yeah, so it kind of highlights all the areas of the earth that are endangered. And because those that are in the southern hemisphere are endangered for opposite reasons than ice and high water. It's just going to be so hot. I don't know how people will live. And we're concerned about immigration now. It's going to be overwhelming when people leave.
I'd like to add something too. It's really important for us as individuals to watch what we do and recycle, etc. But it's also important for us to get out and vote. Because we need to talk to our politicians about our concerns and the fact that we're worried about global warming and we want things to change. What I do is small compared to what our legislatures will be able to do, but we really have to let them know.
They don't seem to want to do anything.
Yeah. So our vote is important, very important.
Yeah.
I have a question. I think there was one piece that talked about that Europe is doing better than America. I didn't hear why or what the differences are.
That was yours.
Is that because their homes are smaller? I don't know.
They're just
That was yours,
I
sorry.
actually think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is they're for a number of years now, they've actively worked at making it really expensive and hard to drive your own car.
Right.
And this idea that's a revelation of New York, why don't we charge people to drive in certain areas of the city to make it so expensive that they'll abandon their cars and start using public transportation. They've been doing that in Europe for years and years and years. And what they do is, and so that's one thing, right? People are driving fewer cars, they take public transportation.
And their distances are less when they drive.
Well, and that's part of it. But public transportation works really well. That's another reason. The trains run on time, the buses run on time. But the other thing is, I can be in town. I probably got an 80-gallon hot water heater sitting over my house right now. And if I turn the water on, it's as hot as can be, right? If you go into European houses, their hot water heaters are this big. And what they literally do is, when you take a shower, it warms the water up as you were using it.
I have
rather
one.
than-
I bought one.
You have one?
Last
And so
summer.
instead of having, cycling, like, come on 8 times a day and heating all that water up whether you use it or not, what they do is they wait until you need hot water and then they use it, right? And it's just stuff like that. Right?
Wow.
And they make, for instance, electricity is very expensive. It's very expensive to use electricity, and so what you do is you turn the lights off when you leave the room. You don't use electricity when you have it.
Gasoline is
And
also very
they make it expensive to use electricity and energy. That's
I
what they
think
do.
people who lived through the Depression turned lights off. I mean,
Yeah.
my mom, if you walked out, it went off.
I just purchased a new washer and dryer. And I was watching them install this thing. This is a product of Sweden, I have to throw that in.
Is that why you bought it?
And he's there turning the pipes and connectors, and I said, hey, you didn't connect the hot water. You don't need it.
Oh.
It has a instantaneous small capacity heater that goes on for a few minutes or so for the washing cycle. And that's it.
Yeah.
Where did you find it?
Well, I bought it up in one of the appliance dealers in Petoskey.
Oh, fantastic.
It was expensive, I must say.
Oh, I'm sure.
But it's great.
Again, it was mentioned earlier, I apologize, I can't remember your name, but Joe, thank you. But the cost of petroleum and gas products in Europe is dramatically different than it is here in the States. And just think about, sort of the many sort of cost crises that we've experienced in the United States across the last 20 or 30 years, and the long lines at gas stations it created, and how much community pushback there was when gas finally hit $3 a gallon or $4 a gallon, kind of thing. Again, it was theoretically some sort of outrage, but in Europe it's been, an ongoing
5, 6.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which obviously influences consumer behavior.
It doesn't in California. I think they're getting
Car
full.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're full. Higher than
But yet at the same time, look at U.S. car manufacturers, and what are they selling these days? Bigger trucks,
I know. It's like
bigger SUVs. Now granted, they're more fuel efficient than they once were.
but not.
Yeah.
Not like you would think.
The car companies for years have made cars for other countries that use less fuel.
Right.
I mean, even their little trucks or whatever, they use less fuel. Okay, I remember being over in the Caribbean where gasoline is really cheap. It's was like 50 cents a gallon or something, but the vehicles use like a fraction of what fuel that our cars in this country use. And it's consumer demand. People demand the larger vehicles to go, longer distances and that sort of thing. And I think if we all sort of rebelled a little bit about that, it might change things.
Yeah. No, I agree.
That is so true. Claudia and I lived in England for a number of years, and while I was there, we drove a Ford C-Max. Before it was manufactured in the United States.
What's the
Our car is a
Similar
model.
size. Oh.
Our car in England got 52 miles per gallon.
Oh.
It was manufactured by Ford.
Yeah.
Now, if they could manufacture a car in England that got 52 miles to the gallon, why can't they do that in the United States?
And that was what, 10 years
People
ago?
don't want
10 years
small.
ago, yeah.
People don't think.
It was 12 years ago.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm a little nobody down in a Honda Accord.
How about a Honda Fit?
Oh, that.
That's what I got. Anyone else want to say? I wanted to say a few more things about Bill McKibben. I have a number of his books. This is called The Reader, Bill McKibben's Reader, and it's
articles from the New Yorker and Atlantic and various magazines that he's written for. But in it, he has an article on Job and Matthew in the Bible. So he takes those characters and works it into his understanding of the world today. And the other is deep economy. So he talks about how much it's going to cost and what's the need to well, the subtitle is the faith of communities, the wealth of communities. I don't read very well. The wealth of communities in the durable future. So that's something maybe I've got to look at again. And then this is a global warming handbook. Sand County Almanac is by Aldo Leopold. Anyone ever heard of Aldo Leopold?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Why do you know him?
I have a bench that he designed to put in the forest.
That's right. The Leopold bench. It's just a plain bench. I have one. My two daughters have one made by Marilyn's brother. Aldo Leopold, I don't remember a lot about his background, but he's considered one of the gurus. He's dead now. He wrote back in the 30s and 40s. He took a piece of property in the middle of Wisconsin and reclaimed it and wrote this almanac about what that reclamation meant in terms of birds coming back and wildlife coming back, and he's revered by anyone who reads environmental literature, as is Rachel Carson, for a different reason. You know, she fought the world of science, fought everybody to get her message out. She's a little harder to read, you know. She's kind of sciencey.
Carson or Carlson?
Carson. Rachel Carson.
C-A-R.
C-A-R.
She's still alive, right?
No, she's not alive. She had cancer and passed away. And then I've got a book about Wangari Maathai. Anyone know her? Kenyan woman who reforested a good part of Kenya. And won the Nobel Peace Prize.
She died of
cancer. And then there's this lovely little book, The Man Who Planted Trees. If you really want to do something.
What was that?
Johnny Appleseed.
I was going to say, is that Johnny Appleseed?
Well, it's that kind of idea.
How about Martin Luther? He said he had a tree.
Yeah, it's a lovely thing. We could plant trees around Zion, much more than we do, or we could offer trees to.
We have a lot of land that you could plant trees on. Anybody wants.
I think in India they planted so many million trees in 24 hours. They had so many people out there, and they were just planting trees in India.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
I'll serve chili.
Have the kind of little heart come over.
You know, and it's amazing, you think, we just were looking at pictures of there was a willow tree in our house when we bought it 20 years ago, and it was like, it was tiny. And we've lived there 20 years, and it's like a big tree now. You just don't realize that,
They're beautiful.
you know, that it can make a difference.
That's why you don't plant willow trees.
Yeah.
You cut those down.
It's a troublesome tree.
Yes, it is. If you want to say anything more, please do. If you want a conversation on this topic to continue, let Ron know. We could start a small group, or we could have another class on a particular thing. Or I don't know.
Do you have any more of your handouts?
Of the books?
Book list?
Book list, yes.
Thank you, Sonja.
Thank you, Sonja. I have a very, yeah.